Okay, welcome back everyone. It's 4/24 of 2015. We're going to look at Lesson 2 in Ricoeur's Doctrine of Selfhood, his epistemology. And we're going to take a look at Ascription as the very primitive first work of elocution at the dialogue threshold. It's a very primitive first level work. We're going to take a look at that. If you remember in our lesson on foundation, we had the 3 steps of abstraction, historical partitioning, and ontological structuring. Well, before you get to that historical partitioning, he wants to look at the very first abstract level, and it is a very primitive level of individualization. And in our first moment, we get involved with trying to develop a shared focal point of sameness with ourselves and those who we are engaged in dialogue with. So through dialogue, we want to reach a shared focus of selfhood as a particular or a group of particulars. And we use the methodology of reference, and we employ intellectual instruments. There are 3 operators. There's description. We want to try to find a shared focus on finding referential descriptions for our very primitive first level signs of personhood. We want to try to seek and find an agreed upon shared focus concerning a name, abstract name, of a very primitive proto-sign. And we also want to find a shared focus on indicators that can help us analyze selfhood within the historical realm of time and space. So we're trying to get a shared focus to determine sameness, because the very first level work at the dialogue threshold is addressing sameness, and we do that by looking at the variations of historical events in the time-space realm of preservation, and whatever remains the same, we can start looking at as at least a hint at permanence, and it can give us our very first clues concerning what would be a proper primitive sign for selfhood. So it very much begins at this very primitive level of individualization. In a second moment, we're going to get a little bit of depth, but it's through adding the description referential material. It's just a stage of adding description, and we're going to use those operators again to accomplish this. We have 2 primitive concepts of physical bodies and personhood. We are using Kant's transcendental deduction methodology to reach this notion of personhood, but all the work is referential and descriptive primarily, and we're just trying to find a shared focus of identifying the referential material. So the 4 aspects at this level of very primitive dialogue consist of entity, which means we just are involved in speaking about personhood as an entity or object, not as something that we are subjectively involved in. Subjectivity has not entered at this level. We're dealing strictly with the spatio-temporal realm of reality, the very realm of bare finitude, and so it is a very primitive analysis at the finite level. It will try to adopt a schema of the identifying sameness that will unveil itself as we continue to reflectively analyze these various historical events to try to acquire that sameness that emerges. And we will be involved in ascription, and that means through reflective analysis we simply partition out those reoccurring sameness aspects in the changing spatio-temporal environment, and then we can kind of group those into a schema and start to develop some very, very, very primitive abstract names for first level signs that we will leave laid bare open, because we don't even address much of a content here. We just want to get the abstract name and some basic referential descriptive material, but nothing at any depth here yet. It's all very primitive first level, dealing primarily with finitude. And specifically, we're dealing with the realm of preservation. So we're looking at preservation, the preserved elements of sameness that reoccur and lead us toward a first level lexical network. So Ricoeur goes on to say that we are going to get involved in this work of ascription, and we deal with modalities that address primarily the physical predicates and the mental predicates. And in the mental predicates, we deal primarily with body states, emotive body states, and not really anything in the level of consciousness or self-consciousness. At this level, we're dealing primarily in the mental realm, we're dealing with emotive body states. And again, we're still in that realm of finite preservation. So we are looking for predicates, referential predicates that we can gather in a shared focus during dialogue, and then to take those predicates and apply them to abstract notions of first level signs. And we do take a look at the directional sense in objective history to look for these recurring elements of sameness. So we are trying to look for the slightly deeper meaning, but still it's very much geared toward finitude and preservation. But we do use the three instruments of description, which deals with class through recurring sameness, and abstract name, definitely abstract name, and we're okay with that because we're just going to postpone the more concrete name for later. We're just going to accept the fact that we're going to deal with abstract name initially at the very primitive level of a lexical network, and then we will try to acquire the indicators that address time and space and tense. But we're really trying to work on a very primitive shared focal point of acquiring referential material to apply to abstract notions of the primitive level of signs, the primitive network that we at least can have as a beginning starting point. You have to have something at a starting point, so you can come up with proto-signs of sameness, I guess you could call it. We're looking to acquire a network of proto-signs of sameness, and that will help us to at least launch our methodology, our hermeneutic of acquiring the signs of personhood. Now, Ricoeur does give us a little bit of a hint in this lesson about where we're going to go, because we're not going to remain in primitive elocution, but he says that we're only dealing with mental states as emotive body states here, but eventually we want to get into true mental states. Well, how do you do that? Well, according to Ricoeur, the two subjects engaged in dialogue and elocution at the dialogue threshold will together posit a third subject of consciousness as a shared consciousness workspace that those involved in dialogue can share in order to develop a little bit deeper level of understanding of our signs and actually get into dealing with very deliberate area of mental predicates. And so consciousness can be located as a posited third at the dialogue threshold. And we are always tension between this logical conceptual work at the primitive level that just doesn't seem to completely satisfy, because there's always that ineffable hiddenness of something deeper that we want to try to acquire. But when we just keep adding description and adding description, we will reach a limit point. We're dealing with finitude. It's going to become a realized limit point, and we're going to need to transition to that third subject of shared positing of a universal consciousness to help us move on to a deeper level of understanding. Because we always know that you lose something in logical conceptualization. I mean, it's okay to deal with logical conceptualization, but you can't rely on that as being capable of enclosing all the truth, because there's always the hidden aspect that doesn't quite fit into logical conceptualization. So the dialogue threshold must open itself up existentially to speech act and self-designation and a shared posited third subject of consciousness. And that will be coming up soon, I'm sure. In this lesson, he just gives us a hint of it. But at this level, he's saying, if you go back to the last lesson, we're at that foundational abstraction first moment. We haven't even entered into historical partitioning yet. So we're at the very first moment of the foundation in last lesson, which is dealing with a laid bare, open, abstract, primitive signs that we will simply postpone for now and allow the dialectical and dialogical work that we are going to become involved with through praxis positing to help us to acquire content that we can start slowly pouring in to these laid bare, open proto-signs that exist only as proto-signs of sameness, and at the same time they're asking for something deeper. They're asking for deeper content. And we will get into that once we get into that praxis historical positing. But at this level, at individualization, we deal simply with recurring sameness in diverging contingent finite reality, and then within that finite reality we just look for the preservation of sameness that keeps showing up. We're looking at the realm of preservation here. We're looking at finite preservation. Nothing deeper than finitude, actually. It's just simply the aspect of preservation that keeps unveiling itself to give us these proto signs of sameness for the concept of personhood, for the category of personhood, I should say. It's a category that's going to abbreviate signs and concepts, but it's a major category of personhood. So we've got a pretty good second lesson launch here from Ricoeur. We've actually understand now in a better way what that first moment was in the introductory lesson. Now we get a better understanding of that first moment of abstraction, that it actually was at the dialogue threshold. It wasn't within a singular individual. Ricoeur did start out at the